Welcome everyone in our audience today. My name is Beth Cleary. I'm a co-founder of the East Side Freedom Library, and I'm very happy to welcome you all and to welcome our featured speaker and three Twin Cities-based respondents. Today's discussion is about JoAnn Wypijewski's What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About #MeToo, an important book about human liberation, among other things, published this very year, 2020, and continuing to be an urgent topic. I'll just let you know a little bit about how our event will conduct itself, and also about ways for you to participate. And first, if you're new at all to the East Side Freedom Library as an organization, I encourage you to visit our website, eastsidefreedomlibrary.org. That's connected to our physical building in St. Paul, Minnesota. And on our website, you can find a listing of upcoming programs. Of course, we're observing online programming only these days. And the best way to stay involved is to subscribe to our newsletter. And you can do that by, I'm just making sure I get you to the right tab, the Get Involved tab on the website site. So as you come into the meeting today, you are automatically muted as viewers and listeners, but you can participate, and we encourage you to, by sending comments and questions to chat if you're on Zoom, or to the comment section of Facebook if you're watching on Facebook. And the co-host, the co-founder of East Side Freedom Library, Peter Ratcliffe, will collect those comments and questions in one area, and Associate Director Clarence White will collect those on Facebook, and I will be able to read them, or they will come on and read them toward the end of the program. So what we'll do today is have a presentation by JoAnn about her book, and then the three respondents, all located in the Twin Cities, will respond, and in each of their responses will be a question. And I'll make note of those questions, as may JoAnn, and so we can start with the respondents' questions, and then we'll be very glad to integrate any that come in from listeners and viewers. So if you are new to the book, perhaps you'll acquire it after today. But what we don't talk about when we talk about #MeToo is a collection of essays which explore the current state of our society's discourse about sexual politics. And the author of the book, JoAnn Wypijewski, is a writer and editor based in New York. From 1982 to 2000, she was the managing editor at The Nation magazine. She's written for that magazine, as well as for Harper's, CounterPunch, the New York Times Magazine, The Guardian, and many other publications. She's on the editorial committee of the New Left Review. She was the co-editor with Kevin Alexander Gray and Jeffrey St. Clair of Killing Trayvons, an Anthology of American Violence. And our respondents today, all based in the Twin Cities, I'm very pleased to introduce now our first respondent, an East Side resident, East Side of St. Paul. Sydney Stewart came to the East Side Freedom Library in the fall of 2019 as an intern through HECUA's Inequality in America program. She's working towards her BA degree in sociology at the University of Minnesota, and is involved with the nonprofit organization Minnesota Youth Collective. She continues to learn about transformative justice and developing new systems and thinking around accountability. After Sydney, we'll hear from Najaha Muse, who as a young girl growing up in rural Ethiopia was witness to rampant gender inequality and social injustice. Her family fled to a refugee camp in Kenya and then immigrated to Minnesota, where Najaha began her formal education in the 3rd grade. She became the first in her family to graduate from high school and receive a college degree. And she's now a 4th-year medical student who has received the Hawkinson Foundation's Peace and Social Justice Award and has been recognized as a top 10 woman in medicine who inspires still by leading, trailblazing, and innovating. And our last respondent, or the third, I'll introduce now. Since retiring as a dancer and choreographer, Michelle Steinwald has managed performing arts projects and professional development programs for professional dance companies across the US. From 2006 to 2013, she was assistant curator for the performing arts at the Walker Arts Center in Minneapolis. Although Canadian, Steinwald is currently living in Minneapolis as an independent curator, community organizer, and writer. So there you have it. Here we are in our various home boxes. And I'll turn things over to JoAnn Wypijewski to introduce your book.
So thank you so much for the introductions. Thank you so much for the invitation. And thank you, Sydney, Najaha, Michelle, for being part of this. I really look forward to the conversation. So I didn't write this book to come out now. I mean, nobody in their right mind would write a book, any book really, to come out now. It is, as Beth mentioned, a collection of work from 1992 to last year, 2019. And it came out this year at the beginning of June. And, you know, its subtitle, so the title essay was written at the time of the Me Too phenomenon. And I wanted at that time to kind of expand the conversation that was being had, which wasn't so much a conversation as a sort of state of alarm. And there were a number of things that I thought came about, ideas to think about, which I had suggested in that essay. We ought to discuss, and that sex, you know, sex in the news, sex scandals, 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, constant sexual scandals, spectacles, phenomena, media panics, as I call them, and many other people, I'm certainly not alone, have had political uses historically. I mean, for a very long time, but really almost unabated for 50 years. And that the political implications of that emotion and that that sort of creation, typically of monsters and victims, of you know, people who are beyond the pale, people who are called perpetrators, who are accused in the press, who are really convicted in the press, who may have done awful things, by the way. I'm not saying people don't do awful things, but the kind of the making of the press as a courtroom, which we have seen ever more, and especially with the amplification of various media, mean that there's a story that gets told, and that story, you know, sort of sinks in the mind. And it's almost a kind of con job on the media's part, because, you know, the constant repetition is very much what a con artist does. You know, it says the same thing over and over again. So you don't have an independent thought, and you don't have another question, and you just repeat and repeat. And some of that may be true. I mean, there may be a kernel of truth in what's happening, but the amplification and the acceptance of a thought, an idea, a story as the only story, has always bothered me. And it also has clearly political consequences. And, we can talk about, so the book, the subtitle of the book really explains the book a little more than the title. It says Essays on Sex, Authority, and the Mess of Life. And what I've been doing for many, many years, and in reporting these stories or writing commentaries, is really thinking about how our actions are embedded in this mess of life, and how very rarely are there monsters and innocents, and very rarely is a situation totally clear cut, and very rarely does it involve simply what has been accused. So, for instance, the first essay is about a HIV panic in the 1990s in upstate New York, where I'm speaking from at the moment. I'm in Buffalo, New York right now. It was a guy who was a sort of entrepreneur, the not huge time drug dealer in a town not far from here, Jamestown. And he'd contracted HIV. Nobody cares how he got it. He wasn't particularly, it's not really clear what he knew, what he thought, whether he was in denial, whether at that time, like many people who had HIV or who were at the time were saying, well, you can't get it. Heterosexuals just can't get it. In any case, he had sex with a number of young women, some of whom turned out positive, and immediately the story became a story that he was a predator, that he was a lethal Lothario, that he was the devil himself. All of these terms were used in the papers all the time. He eventually pled guilty to having sex with younger women, so statutory rape when he was, I think, 19 and they were 15 or 14. I think there was one or two. I always thought one, but lately someone has said there were two. So, but in any case, he pled guilty to that. He served 12 years in jail and prison combined, rather horrific time. And when he was to get out, the state of New York said, oh, no, you are a sexually dangerous person. And as a sexually dangerous person, we are going to try to put you away forever. We're going to try to put you in a mental institution forever. And it's called civil commitment, and we don't call it punishment because the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court and all federal courts, have said, no, this is treatment. These are people who have psychological problems. This is treatment. And there's no choice in the matter. There's a little trial. It's a kind of kangaroo court. They didn't let the press in. He was the only Black figure in a room full of white people in a town where the trial was held, of very white town that was very angry because of what happened 12 years earlier. And he was, declared sexually dangerous. And so now he is one of 6,000 people who are in indefinite detention after their sentences in mental institutions because of what they might do. So, that's a consequence of a panic. That's a very real consequence. Now, the fact that there are 6,000 people is also a very real consequence. The fact that there are about 900,000 people, maybe more, on the sex offense registries around the country who are effectively exiled from public life, from society, are effectively banished, often can't find a place to live, can't find work, can't go to school, can't take their children, if they have children, to school, to any school event, to any parent-teacher conference. If they're parents of a youth who's living in the house, they must banish alcohol from their homes, even if the crime didn't involve alcohol, must eliminate all the pictures of the grandchildren, even if the crime didn't, the alleged crime or the crime didn't involve children. There is a kind of disposability which we come to accept. Obviously, we have accepted that 6,000 people can be declared sexually dangerous, and that 900,000 to 1 million can be put on registries and effectively, exiled. And I'll just stop with one current thing. So in terms of how, and we can talk about the history of how sex panics have been used politically, but there's something that's unfolding at the moment and has been unfolding for some time, which clearly was influenced by sex claims, which now aren't even claims, aren't there anymore, were never pursued, but which had a chilling effect on the press, on the left. So Julian Assange is now really fighting for his life in a trial for extradition to the United States, where he is wanted for espionage. He's not declared a journalist. He's not declared somebody who's been working as part of the free press. He's considered a very dangerous person. He faces 175 years in the US or worse, which is, again, the sort of amplification of time is part of the prison system, and the punishment system is what I'm concerned about, and how we on the left participate in that, even with our good intentions. Well, anyway, just to finish up, so Assange, in 2010, there were rape allegations from Sweden. Now, Julian Assange had never raped anyone, and even the complainants at that time did not go to the police with rape allegations. They said they wished the police would intervene in some way to get him to wear a condom. And the police said, well, we really don't know what to do with this. And he was never charged with sexual assault, by the way. He was never charged with rape. The charges were mulled three times they were dropped. There never was a case. But he is now a defendant in a cage in Britain, crawling on his knees to make eye contact with his lawyer, strip searched every day. He told John Pilcher, I think I'm losing my mind. He's been in solitary confinement for ages. He was in the Ecuadorian embassy for 7 years. And I wrote about this, it's not in the book, but I wrote about this at the time, in 2010 for The Nation. And, a lot of people in the office had already decided, oh, well, he's a rapist. I mean, I don't think you can defend him. Well, these were allegations, and then they were murky. And then if you look into it, they weren't even allegations of rape. So, but someone is suffering now, and nobody, the press that won prizes, the left that, once thought exposing high crimes, exposing war crimes was important, has not been roused at all in defense of this individual who is a victim of the state and states, actually. So I'll just stop there. I look forward to the conversation because I think you all have much more to add. So.
Thank you, JoAnn, very much. Sydney, would you like to start off the series of responses?
Sure. Thank you, JoAnn, and thank you, Beth. I guess I just have kind of a bunch of jumbled notes that I took reading this book. I feel like I haven't really sat down and read just an entire collection of essays, so that was something different for me. And then on the specific subject, like how relevant it is to things that have been happening, or this like onslaught of a Me Too movement taking place in the Twin Cities among musicians. Mm-hmm. It was just a kind of perfectly timed read. So I think what was interesting was learning a little bit about, or thinking a little bit more about like the nuances and complexities of sexual interactions, and how this can be morphed or skewed depending on the perspective or angle that's taken. Like you talk a lot about in the book, the ways that media kind of like switches this perception. And one quote that I wanted to sort of talk about, if that's okay, if I read something from here. You say in your essay, what we don't talk about when we talk about #MeToo, in the cauldron of panic, definitions collapse. Abuse might be a comment, a caress, a violent act. Suspicion of deeds rouses the same alarm as deeds. Sex misunderstandings and mistakes about sex may be labeled deviance, depending on the speaker, depending on the subject. There is no time, no air for distinctions. Rape, a terrible and serious crime, is conflated with behavior that may not be criminal at all, with the perverse effect that efforts to ensure fair criminal investigations and eliminate bias against people who report rape are undermined. Insisting on distinctions on skepticism as a fundamental element of journalistic inquiry, and most of all, on the rights of any accused, is called denial. And I think that that's like an important aspect of this conversation, is that there isn't room to have the conversation.
Exactly.
So I think that initially going into reading this book, I felt a little bit weary because I was on that side a little bit of like, it's not really a subject that you should be very critical of. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of ways, it's invalidating to somebody with experience being sexually abused to be questioned. So I understand that. But I think that this book gives a lot of good stories and information to understanding those sort of nuances. Yeah, and I think also looking at the ways that our views are kind of skewed based on media perception was something that was very clear to me in the most recent uprisings, like attending protests, being on the ground and seeing the community that was like forming around the Black Lives Matter movement, and seeing people handing out masks and giving water and checking in to see if you're okay, like face-to-face real community interactions happening, and then turning around and watching it on CNN and it's like buildings are burning and the whole block is on fire and everybody's freaking out, and like this whole other panic that's happening. So my question for you about this book is that it's offering a commentary and perspective on sex panics. And right now we're in this like extreme state of polarization. So do you see this book as a useful tool for developing a framework to address the various panics of today in the US, from race, sexual, or moral?
Mm-hmm. Oh, now, do I answer? No, we go around, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm keeping track. I'm sure you'd love to respond. I mean, that's such a great question.
No, I mean, that's great. Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
It allows, I'm sure it'll allow JoAnn to unfurl so much. But let's keep with our plan, and then I'll make sure I retain your eloquent question and repose it if need be. So, Najaha, if you're ready to respond to your time.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, JoAnn, for being with us today. I have just a few points that I wanted to highlight. They'll begin with the quote from the book or an excerpt from the book, and then I give a little bit of an explanation for each. And then I'll pose my question at the end. One of the first highlights from the book I have is the quote that begins with, long before any of us learn about sex, we learn about authority. This is in the prologue where JoAnn explains the pleasure-seeking activity of child's play, how children challenge boundaries set by authority in search of autonomy. She argues that these acts demonstrate defiance of fear, reenacting adult-like behavior in a world that's filled with fear. Later on, she goes on to define the term sex panic or moral panic as a social eruption over the threat to innocence of particularly white women and children. This panic is further propagated by newly enacted legislation, the media, and politics. As a society and as individuals, we voluntarily give power to politicians in the authority, such as police and our social justice system, to prosecute and enforce laws that disproportionately affect those who are powerless, particularly minorities and those who hold unpopular opinion. So I thought that excerpt from the book really brought you back to today's social ills, so to speak. The second excerpt, I thought that really stood out to me, starts with the politics of good and evil leave only righteousness and shame. Complex humanity evaporates in shame, and we're back in the garden, stitching fig leaves into garments. This is chapter 2, where JoAnn explores the topic of certainty and truth and how individual narratives shape them. She argues that in literature, quote, truth is an investigation, not an endpoint, end quote. To that end, the story or narrative is a medium or a tool to showcase our humanity and all its complexity. That we as spectators should first and foremost strive to gain wisdom rather than certainty. In chapter 16, she explores James Baldwin, habits of thought, exploring his writings and highlight some of his work that invite readers to self-reflect. She writes, he insists that liberation is also a mandate of individuality, how one separates oneself from the habits of thought that reinforce and sustain the habits of power. In essence, how one comes into his or her humanity. JoAnn brings to the forefront the dystopia that we live in today, a time of perpetual war, civil unrest, totalitarian politics, and a surveillance state. It reminds us that we must and should remain as individuals in our thought and humanity. My question to JoAnn is, with the understanding that our news and media is constantly filtered to distribute narratives that fit the broader politics of war, what can your average citizen do to protect themselves from being used for such propaganda? Thank you.
Thank you, Najaha. Another great question that I'm sure JoAnn is eager to speak with you about. Great. Michelle, if you're ready, taking notes.
Yes, I am taking notes. I am taking notes. It's, you know, and I'm similarly winging it because, you know, the Me Too movement has meant a lot to me. The conversation around consent is a conversation that should have been long ago discussed more openly. So, you know, we can understand what constitutes rape and sexual violence. And so I was, you know, thrilled to get this invitation to read your book. I took, I've been eagerly listening to podcasts, you know, especially last winter and then into the pandemic, even more reason to be listening to firsthand accounts around sexual violence and abuse of power. And in the podcast 30 for 30 that followed Bikram and the abuse there, and Believed that followed the gymnasts around Larry Nassar, and you know, This American Life has had a few episodes really centering women's voices around sexual violence in the workplace. And most recently watching the miniseries, I think it's on Hulu, I May Destroy You. And with the rape that she experiences in the miniseries, there's a conversation that happens with a police officer where removing a condom is rape. If it, you know, the sex could have been consensual, but that a man removing their condom without not the woman's knowledge or anybody's knowledge, their partner's knowledge, is a form of rape. And I recently went through training with the federal government around sexual harassment for employees, and the trainer, it's a videotaped training that that I watched, and the trainer said that sexual harassment, if somebody does elevator eyes, so he defined that, you know, you walk into a room and somebody looks you up and down, that is sexual harassment. And so for me, you know, recently this conversation around consent and what is abuse of power and those recent definitions that I wouldn't have, because we live in a rape culture. I wouldn't have defined, you know, somebody removing a condom as rape if the initial interaction was consensual, or that somebody looking at me inappropriately as being sexual harassment. So this conversation that is happening is so much more expansive now. And so really, you know, was thrilled, you know, the title of the book maybe misled me a little bit, because I'm used to having survivors' stories really centered in the stories. And I understand where you're coming from around undoing the panic and taking the time, and especially with the essay around Matthew Shepard and Laramie, and taking the time to let the dust settle after the media has packed up and gone to the next sensational story, and that they make sensational, and to take the time and the due diligence around what were all the factors. Let me give some background, and the way that you are often taking time to do a little tangential turns to come back into the story, right? Like that there's a sense of, there isn't a sense of urgency, and so much of what I've been reading and listening to has a sense of urgency. And so my question to you is a little bit like what Nahaja just said, like, what is the call to action? Where do you see yourself? And what is your goal with collecting these stories? And, you know, I recognize too that a lot of the reading I do on my own is often queer voices. And so there is a lot of self that gets put into stories. And I think I was a little disoriented reading your essays, because I couldn't always place you within the story. And where do you, what motivates you? Because I could see with the collection a pattern of taking the time, you know, taking the time with Woody Allen. Let's talk about where people live. What are, you know, so there's some laying a foundation that I really respect in what you're doing. And it is counter to the excitement that a lot of, and the filters that are being put on journalism now to get people's attention. And with your introduction today, I also have a little side question around why aren't the sex panics around President Trump sticking? Why? With everything else that is being inflated, why is that one not? So a little question B, but yeah, your position within your writing, I'd love to know more about where that call to action and where you see your contribution to the conversation.
Okay.
Wow, what a great set of questions.
Yes.
JoAnn, do you want me to review or any of them to restate, or do you just want to keep responding and I'll
I think I can I took notes.
Okay.
So I think I can I may answer some of these questions sort of compound because they interact rather. And I may, as my writing, take some detours. And I think people should jump in when, as they like, or if I say something, you know, that is not relevant or does not respond to you, or you just have something to add. I mean, I think we should try to figure out how to have this as a conversation. That would be really great. So I'm going to take the last question first, just because it's you know, where do I see myself? And this relates to what Najah says as well. You know, I consider myself a political leftist. I grew up here in Buffalo, working class girl, not really part at all of the media establishment when I arrived in New York and realized, that is a very, very small, tight, elite group of people who run the magazines, run the newspapers, run the broadcasting. They go to the same schools. They know each other. It's very hard to become to enter that. It may be different now because they all need content, you know. You know, I've always been interested in class issues. I've always been interested in everything that comes along with class issues. So before we all used the word intersectional, you know, of course you thought about poverty, of course you thought about violence, of course you thought about color, of course you thought about race, of course you thought about ethnicity, you know, I mean, class, and you thought about power, you thought about authority, you thought about state authority and corporate authority, and that would include media authority, whose stories get told, whose stories don't get told, whose stories have some nuance, whose stories are just cardboard figures. And I guess you know, I used to write about labor and class union politics a lot, and there I often had an agenda. You know, I often had there was a side, and that side was the union side. But that was always complicated too, because the workers who were in struggle were often in struggle with their unions. So that wasn't even that clear cut. I mean, and I guess throughout my career, I've gained an appreciation for, you know, the complexity of situations, and nowhere more so, I think, than in sexuality, because you know, the things that you mentioned, Michelle, are interesting, that immediately they were defined as crimes. So taking off a condom, which is not a cool thing, is a crime. It's rape. elevator eyes, which frankly, I mean, I look people up and down, I suppose, too. I mean, I come from a different time. Uh, I mean, I like the way people look. I don't consider that sexual harassment, although I probably would if someone, you know, if I was there for a job or something. But that's a crime, sexual harassment. Elevator eyes, is that a crime? Is that misbehavior? Is that just like uncool? I mean, so the immediate definition of things as a crime, I think, is something very concerning in a country that has more prisoners and more people with criminal records than anywhere in the world. So I think that that's something that I have taken very seriously. What is our responsibility in a society that is a prison state, that is the biggest prison state in the world? What is our responsibility as people living who are always enlisted to participate in spectacles of punishment through assent or as jurors or as witnesses or as person on the street, you know, and how on the left we might make these differences, like, oh well, they're in prison for drug crimes, you know, and that's, you know, we can make an argument for why somebody shouldn't be there, but we're very squeamish when it comes to sex. Now a drug crime can be very violent, it can be non-violent, it can be dangerous to a community, it can be just reefer, you know. So, but still, we don't have a problem talking about the war on drugs. We have a problem talking about the war on sex. We are more, or we are more easily prone to agree that whoever is accused of a sexual crime must be a criminal, must be punished with prison. And they will have those definitions. They will be rape or sexual abuse or whatever. I'm interested that Sydney is involved in transformative justice because I'm very interested in that, but I don't write about that. There's a book out now, and it's not to say I won't, but I mean, I haven't. There's a book out now called The Feminist and the Sex Offender by Judith Levine and Erica Miners, also from Verso, came out shortly before my book. And they talk a lot about harm. How do we think about harm? How do we deal with harm? Are we, you know, again, given that we are in the prison state, in a place where people are regularly put behind bars, you know, does it not demand that we as conscious people say, well, this cannot stand, this cannot be the only way we respond to things, and what are the alternatives? And so in that book, they talk about, you know, how you address harm, how you think about harm, how you think about alternatives. I don't have a call to action per se. This book is not an action agenda, and none of the pieces that I have written, even if they have, I mean, I may be not present as an I mean, I am sometimes, but I'm not often present as an I, but I think I'm present all the time. I mean, you know what I'm looking at, you know what I'm seeing, you know what I'm deciding to present to you, you know what ideas are rumbling through my head, or what questions I'm dealing with. And I think, and thank you, Najaha, very much for mentioning the Baldwin chapter, because there's a quote that he wrote somewhere, and I wrote it down, but I didn't ever put the citation. And I usually do, you know, but I didn't in this case. But he talks about habits of thought and how habits of thought reinforce and sustain habits of power. And he suggests that it's every human person's responsibility to separate oneself from the habits of thought that do reinforce and sustain habits of power. So as I say in the title essay, Nothing Says Patriarchy Like the Police State, I think, you know, we have to always, always think about how what we automatically presume and automatically say, yes, this indeed is true, how that reinforces and sustains the machinery of the state, the machinery of punishment. It's a never-ending cycle. So my goal really always, because I think once upon a time when I was maybe starry-eyed, I thought, oh, you know, journalists can change the world, you know, if only they knew the truth. But I don't know if I'm jaded or just very old, or I don't really believe if only they knew the truth. And that relates to Michelle's point about Trump. I mean, people know the truth. I was reading a story about the woman who recently came out saying she was the girlfriend of a guy who was pals with Trump. And years ago, she went to a US Open and they were having a weekend of frivolity and enjoyment. And Trump basically said, you should be with me. And he grabbed her and he tried to kiss her. He did kiss her. And anyway, it was all very ugly. And she told her friends at the time, and this was in the 80s, I think, one of the friends, her closest friend, went on to vote for Trump. I mean, knew this. She voted for Trump in 2016, and she says, like, well, now maybe it's a little troubling to her. Now, I can't presume what's going on in that person's mind. I can't presume what's going on in anyone's mind. And what's going on with, you know, you could argue about how the Christians, you know, some of the evangelicals say that they support him because he's chosen by God. And so it doesn't matter what he does. He can be like David. You know, David lusted after Bathsheba. You know, he sent her husband to the front line. He got murdered. He took Bathsheba as his own. I mean, she was willing in the Bible anyway. And God, you know, God took his firstborn son, you know, said, well, you know, your firstborn son will die. But, you know, then your secondborn will be Solomon, and he'll be a great king, and we'll remember him. And then he wrote this great erotic poem, Song of Solomon. But the point is, they just say, well, he's chosen. And if you're chosen, it doesn't matter how bad it is. Now, everyone else, why he gets away with it, I can't speak for them. I mean, you know, they think abortion is legal. They want tax breaks. They think that's more important. But I do think that Me Too kicked off in part, I mean, hashtag Me Too, kicked off in part because Trump was getting away with it. And I think people needed a substitute. And I think, you know, not to say that the people who were then accused, you know, were all innocent or were innocent of any and everything. But I think that the passion of it and it taking hold at that time had absolutely something to do with Trump being immune, you know. So anyway, so my agenda in a way has been to get people to think more in a more complicated way about stories that are presented with such appalling simplicity, because it's so easy to find the monster it's so easy to say, let's get him, you know. It's much harder to think about all the ways something might be complicated. It's so much more difficult to think about, you know, why, you know, we criminalized HIV, you know, I mean, right now, if you don't tell, in 37 states, I think, if you don't tell a sex partner that you're HIV positive, even if your viral load is down to nothing, even if you are you know, you're supposedly can't transmit the virus, even if you don't have intercourse, but you have other things. I mean, there are all kinds of cases where people are sent to jail for this. And this relates to what we did right at the start of the HIV panic. We made it an issue of criminalization rather than public health. And so I think we have to be very skeptical of that. And I think we have to ask who benefits and what does it serve? And I think that's where, I mean, that's my agenda. I mean, I want people to, I hope, you know, everyone in this life, we have such little power and we have such little time. And, you know, so what you really hope is that someone reads what you write. And so I'm so grateful for all your really attentive reading, because frankly, a lot of people don't want to think any harder and don't want to think beyond what, you know, what is the common way of thinking. And I mean, I've encountered this many times, and it's not like this book has not been reviewed in the major places. It got a great review in TLS in London, but in the US, it's been, you know, pretty marginally reviewed. So, but I still think, you know, what is the meaning of your life? You know, you press on and you hope that you say something that's valuable, and you hope that you make people think. And again, I think Najaha, you quoted, you know, that line from the title essay, where I talk about in literature in various places, you know, what is truth? And in literature, truth is an investigation and not an endpoint. And truth is something that's very hard. I mean, you know, it's sometimes very easy, you know, sometimes it's very easy to know what the truth is. A lot of times it's very hard to know. But what is striking to me is how we accept in journalism what we'd never accept in literature. You know, books would be trashed. They would never be, you know, celebrated if they told the kinds of stories that we accept readily in journalism. You know, readily we want a conclusion. We want to know what happened. And we assume that the journalist who runs out and, you know, has a 10, 15 minute, hour conversation with someone knows the truth. And then multiple people repeat that. Mostly, I mean, often they talk to a lawyer or something, and the lawyer says, well, this is what this says. And then they just repeat it. And then all the other people repeat it because it's been in the New York Times after all. And so, you know, I think people need to be critical. You know, I think people need to own their own minds, really need to ask those questions and think, what am I being asked to accept here? What is missing here? What's under this scandal? What would I do? What would I do if I were in the shoes of this person? If I were the complainant, if I were the accused, what would I do? What would I think? And I mean, it's like we went from saying that every accuser was a slut who shouldn't be believed to now saying that every accuser must be believed and is a, you know, just a paragon of virtue. And I'm talking about many, many victims. I mean, and many maybe. And I'm not undermining the reality of violence, far from it. I'm glad you said #MeToo, by the way, when you said the title of the book, because I think there's a real difference between #MeToo and Me Too, as Tarana Burke started it. And #MeToo is really kind of hijacked what Tarana Burke, working with younger and with younger women and with women of color, you know, for her, Me Too is kind of a signal saying, I want a hearing, but I'm not ready to say yet. So, you know, she was having educational sessions with people, and they were talking about their lives, and they were talking about violence in the context of their lives, sexual violence, other kinds of violence, and everything else, right? And she said, well, you know, if you feel the need to register that something happened to you that also happened to other people in the conversation, but you're not ready, you just write Me Too, you know, and that's like a placeholder to say there's something I want to talk about, but I can't do it right now. So it was kind of like, I want a hearing. But #MeToo, you know, it hijacked that, and basically it said, okay, we're going to have our say, and nobody who's accused gets a hearing. And I think that actually typifies something that happens all the time. It certainly typifies the experience of young men, largely young men, in jail and in prison. You know, they don't really get a hearing. They don't get a trial. Most people don't get a trial. They don't have lawyers who are going to fight for them. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But the system is worked in such a way that mostly they're just going to plead out because what they face is impossible. And so, I mean, I think all these things are critical, and I think those are the things that really drive me. And the other thing is, you know, the other relationship to #MeToo and Me Too is that, you know, we're so interested in personality and the, you know, certain details of violence, but not in the way in which violence is part of, you know, the violence in the story is part of a much larger story of political violence, family violence. You know, I mean, I'm not, I was taken to task somewhere for saying in a piece about the priest scandal that, you know, I said something about family violence and in relationship to this, and I was criticized for not taking seriously accusations against priests, and that's far from it. But it's to say that there is no upside to the press, you know, for anyone who says daddy raped me, you know, it's or uncle or whatever. It's, you know, too common for scandal. So we don't talk about that. We don't talk about how much, I mean, we don't talk about economic violence, family violence, economic violence that leads to family violence. This is something that is very common right now during the pandemic when people are locked down, and not just sexual violence, but all kinds of violence. We don't talk about how being in the prison state, being in a country that sees war or bombings or assassinations, targeted killings as the way to solve all our problems. You know, how does that filter into our psyches? What does it mean that there's a generation that has never known a time when we're not bombing, killing, and wiping out I mean, we've always been doing it, but now we're doing it on a quite grand scale. And there's no movement. There's no anti-war movement. There's no, you know, okay, I've been talking a lot, but I did not respond to Sydney's question, which was whether I see the book as a tool for sort of addressing various panics or the polarization of our current situation. Is that about right? So I think so, because the also related to Michelle's point about where I see myself. I think the reason I got interested in sex panics and sex scandals is because one, they're an area where a lot of ideological where ideological differences don't make so much difference. So pretty much you have a lot of left buy-in or progressive or liberal buy-in to the story of that's at the center of sex scandal as the media presents it, getting the bad guy, getting the monster, and so it's the question of sex at the center of these scandals and at the center of media sort of frenzies sort of clarifies things that are often that are not as obvious or not as clear in other circumstances. But the example you gave is a perfect example of being in the protests this spring and having one experience and having that experience essentially invisibilized because it was much more exciting for the media and for the politicians. I mean, Donald Trump doesn't stop talking about it. You'd think the cities were on fire everywhere. You'd think that it never stopped, that you'd think that 1967 and 65 and 68 never happened. I mean, you'd think that we'd never known social explosion. You'd also think that we shouldn't even consider the fact that there might be agent provocateur, that there might be, burnings happening or violence happening because, it's easy to join into a mass. There was a young guy, I was breaking off from the sort of daytime part of the protest in New York City, and because I didn't participate in the night things. I've seen the police at night in New York too much, and it's terrifying, and I'm elderly. But these two kids, they were very sweet, and everything that you had talked about, Sydney, people sharing masks, people being careful, people carrying extra bottles of water or whatever. That was all a reality. But they also said, the scariest thing is we don't know who to trust. Like we have our crew and we're with our crew, but we don't know exactly who to trust sometimes because we don't know, if the people next to us, there are people who just want to fight the police. There are people who just want to break into stores. There are people who don't want to do that at all. There are people who will be driven to do that. There are people who want to provoke that. And nobody wants to be arrested, because the cops are, of course, very dangerous. So, it was a complicated situation. It was a volatile situation. But I mean, I, like you, were at protest after protest where, you didn't have that feeling, where that wasn't the dominant idea, or not the dominant idea, but the dominant sentiment, where, peaceful protest is exactly what you had. So I think how do people, how do people protect themselves? I guess this was Najaha's question. Was that your question? How can average citizens protect themselves from propaganda? I mean, I think you have to try to exist in a constant state of questioning. Who is this serving? And why is this story getting repeated over and over again? Why do we keep seeing? I mean, I keep seeing, you do too, that picture. I mean, it's a great image. I think it's from Minneapolis. There's a guy and he's carrying an American flag and it's kind of tattered, and behind you see burning. And it's just it's an excellent photograph. But I mean, the number of times I've seen it, this is done often in the media thoughtlessly. It's a good picture. It's something did happen. Obviously, there's the picture. Let's go with it. Let's run it again. I mean, there's often not an agenda for some of those things, but it will be used. It will be taken. It will be run away with, and it will support the hand of authority, the hand of power. And so how do we separate ourselves from those habits of thought that reinforce and sustain habits of power? It's a lifetime work. And it's harder. It's harder now. I don't know if I've satisfied any of those questions, but I really, I liked all of them.
I appreciate when you first were starting to talk about when you introduced today's conversation around, it's so rare that it is about monsters versus victims, that clear cut. And really undoing the binary that is so ingrained in colonial thinking, that it's easy to separate us into two camps if there's only two. Mm-hmm. And really the time it takes. And there's something human about, like, there's something immediately satisfying with, like, I'm on this side or that side. I can pick and I can move on with my day. And we've been trained because that helps keep us in line. So to have that time it takes to think, I really appreciate what you're saying. And it, for me, falls in line with this. How do I undo the habit of binary thinking?
Or just, like, especially when you watch a trial, when there is actually a trial. I watched the Harvey Weinstein trial now in New York. Now, Harvey Weinstein may be a really, really awful person, and there are many stories that say he is. But if he was not Harvey Weinstein in that defense chair, and it was your brother or your father or your lover or your uncle or your cousin or anyone you cared about, and he was being convicted, he was being tried for certain actions that were being made, that were being talked about in the context of a present that just has determined that whatever he has done is done, and it was that way, and nothing had to be corroborated. And in fact, people who were brought, the girlfriend of one of the accusers, letters from both of the accusers to Weinstein emails, statements that one had made to a life coach and to another online figure. I can't remember, psychic. All of these things were being presented as evidence. And she was telling a very clear-cut story of monstrosity. It's terrible, terrible thing. And there was nothing but doubt, actually. There was enormous amounts of doubt. Now, someone is supposed to be convicted beyond a reasonable doubt. But in that courtroom, the benefit of the doubt was given entirely to the accusers. And even when people questioned their claims or said that didn't happen, it didn't happen like that, it happened this way, or even when their own words contradicted what they said, well, I was lying then. I was lying in all those emails, but now I'm telling the truth. And so the jury was asked to give the benefit of the doubt to the prosecution side, to the state. Now, I understand why people wanted to convict Harvey Weinstein. But if you looked at that trial, just as you might, as if it were you or your family member or someone you cared about, you would be appalled that that person or yourself got no benefit of the doubt, that reasonable doubt didn't matter, that essentially the prosecution said he was, the accusers were children walking in the forest to the gingerbread house, not noticing the oven behind, like that they were in a fairy tale, that they were children, that they were basically in a fairy tale. This was used by the state in the opening statements. You know, body shaming was de rigueur in that trial. It was something that we all normally don't like, but it was okay. And again, I think you have to put yourself in those positions and say, wait a minute. This is being called justice. And we know we mostly don't see justice. We mostly don't see what happens with other people, with other people's cases. But we're seeing this, and we're seeing that it doesn't matter, and everyone is celebrating and saying, oh, it's spectacular. And then the New York Times publishes an image at the end and says, Me Too victory, and it's a silhouette of Harvey Weinstein. And so it's all, you know, blacks and grays, and then there's a couch where his mouth would be in white, and it has legs, and the legs look like fangs. So it's, you know, the lessons of Me Too's monster. So here we are. We're in kindergarten. We're with fairy tales. I mean, you know, it's a problem. How do you guard against it? I guess you just have to try not to think like the crowd when the crowd is, you know, I mean, and sometimes the crowd is right, but you know, I mean, this is kind of a tangent, but I mean, you know, Dr. King said that, you know, life is individual, life is social. And so how do we balance those things? You know, they're not, you are an individual, you are in society. Society matters, individuality matters. Your habit of thought matters, and what the crowd's habit of thought matters in possibly different ways.
I'm thankful for what Sydney had, you know, mentioned around the music community here in the Twin Cities, and similarly in the theater and dance communities, organizations and systems of abuse are coming to light, and while I do feel that Harvey Weinstein, I hear what you're saying, and at the same time, it was his time. It was time, right, for somebody to go down, because we have, and I understand, if you isolate him as a case, maybe he didn't get the benefit of the doubt, but there's a sense of like we're layering. I think that, what happened in the Twin Cities music community may not have escalated to become news had it not been for the R. Kelly documentary and trial around that abuse. So it's interesting that in some ways we're learning, we're using the knowledge from other cases to build more vocabulary.
Okay, and go ahead, Sydney.
I think it's interesting because for me, even after what took place on a local scale, it's kind of like now this step of social media call outs maybe, or another person loses their job or some respectable position, and then they no longer have community surrounding them that will actually hold them accountable. But it's also known that oftentimes the justice system doesn't work in the favor of victims of sexual assault.
Yeah.
And so it's a very fine line, and it's hard to navigate and figure out like what is the next step besides just the call out and besides just the scandal of the entire thing and that people know about it. It's like where does society move?
Sort of a great and huge and a very important question that I wonder if we all, in our commitments to staying unsettled, thanks to this really substantial conversation, couldn't take back into our own work and communities. How do we keep being part of the work of transformation? I'm just aware, breaking in as I am, that this conversation could go on a long time, and maybe we'd best for now pause it. But I know that I've sent messages to people on Zoom to lob any questions in, because we'd be wrapping up soon, and I haven't received any. So I'm going to assume that we are in the clear to end altogether. So if there aren't any last words, I'll just thank you all so much. And thanks to those of you listening and viewing in Zoom and on Facebook. And ESFL thanks the local friends who are here to respond, and JoAnn and your decades of work as a journalist activist. On behalf of...
Can I ask a question?
Please do.
Can I ask if Najaha has anything she'd like to add?
Actually, we're gonna ask for a few seconds to ask a question.
Please.
I want to know your thoughts, JoAnn, on the current cancel culture. Do you think that this type of movement is a counter to authority? Is it holding authority accountable? What is your perspective on it? And my thoughts are that it's also very binary, as we were talking about. I feel that it is one-sided, and it's a dangerous way to think, but also I feel like there may be some truth to it, and it is serving justice in a sense, but I fear that that can also lead us to the wrong path.
Well, I don't like the term cancel culture, because of course it's become a term. And now what does it mean? It means all kinds of things. It means people being angry about Confederate monuments on public land, and it means shouting down speakers you don't agree with. So I think that you shouldn't shout down people you disagree with. I think you should listen to them, and I think you should volley back. And I think that someone's invited on campus, you know, there's all kinds of ways to protest their views and to challenge their views without shouting them down and driving them out and making them victims, actually, and saying, oh, poor me, look, I was trying to be, you know, a freedom fighter and they are just Stalinists. And, you know, you know, there is no reason that Confederate monuments should be on public land. There just isn't. But then it gets into all that more complicated stuff. Like, what about all the other people all around who, you know, did terrible things? And, you know, should we knock down their statues everywhere? Should we wipe away their names? Well, I don't agree with that, because I think, you know, in those names and in those statues are some history, it's our history, and it's ugly and it's messy. And some of what those individuals did was heinous, and some of it was actually not. And so, I mean, while there's no justification for the state edifying, you know, traders and slaveholders, I do think that, you know, you wonder who's going to be, you know, whose names are going to be replaced with whose, and what's then decided, like the best life, or the true life, the unblemished life. This idea that there might be some people who have never done anything untoward, you know, have never done anything icky, or something someone doesn't believe in. I think we have to face the fact that our country is, you know, a country that was founded on genocide and slavery, and that's just true. And so if those, like, if there are monuments to the dead of the Civil War, well, you know, not Robert E. Lee on a horse in a city park, but you know, just a memorial to the dead. I mean, that's something that happened, and a lot of people were, you know, they were hustled into it. They were believers. They went along the way people always do. I mean, you know, you have to ask questions of monuments. You have to ask questions about the namings of things. You know, you go around army bases and the schools are named after, you know, 24th Armed Battalion or something. And you're like, what? Why is the school called that? But the society of that town has agreed that the army can be like the namer of schools. Well, I found it shocking in Texas, in Killeen, Texas. But, you know, people there think, oh, well, it's okay. Well, no, it's not so okay. I mean, even if all those soldiers are really great on guys, you know, it's the war machine. Your high school's named after the war machine. And, you know, there's a certain logic to it. How do you think about that logic? How do you think about who we value, who we don't? Let's not pretend that we're some society. And, you know, that's what I worry about is it's a perfect corporate thing. You know, corporations can get on this thing, you know, they can say, oh, you know, we're all kind of kumbaya, you know, buy our product. Well, they're not, we're not, you know, and our history is not. And so we've got to understand, we've got to see the mess of things. We've got to see the complexity of things. The complexity of things actually gives us more political insight than the simplicity of things. Simplicity of things just says there's some bad apples, or there's some bad people, or there was a bad time. No, it's more tricky.
Thank you for that response.
So. Yes, thanks so much. So I think we'll wrap this up for today, but again, my thanks to all of you. And this recording will remain available on the ESFL's website and also on the library's Facebook page. So for anyone who would like to access it later or send your friends, there it will be. So again, thank you, and I hope we can see you all again soon.
Thank you so much, all of you. I so appreciate your attention and your interest and your questions and your presence. It's really gratifying. I appreciate it. Thank you. And
thank you, everyone.
And Peter and the library, Freedom Library.
Yes.
Yes. General gratitude. Thank you to all so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.